got to think like a meme, not an ad, when you start building kind of this kind of work from the ground up in these kind of online creator and influencer spaces.
Hello, I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Think with Google Firestarters, and Firestarters is a series of insightful conversations with the interested and the interesting of the marketing, advertising and innovation communities. And today on the podcast, we're looking into the application of marketing in the context of a modern fragmented media environment. And joining me to talk about this fascinating topic, we are lucky to have Simon Carr, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Omnicom agency Hearts and Science. So Simon, welcome to Firestarters. Can I begin, as I always do, by just asking what your provocation is for the Firestarters audience?
Hi, Neil. So my provocation is that I believe that brands and businesses in the modern world today are actually forgetting the fundamentals of brand building in relation to their overall business performance. And that's in terms of rethinking how we think about the past and embracing the learnings of the past and applying that to what that means in the future. And I believe that's even more important in the media landscape that we now operate in, the digitally fragmented media landscape, and how consumers are responding to that landscape.
Yeah, brilliant. And as a way into this, I'm going to ask you a bit about a column, a media leader column that you wrote, which was really talking a lot about category entry points. So the kind of cues or situations or triggers that consumers that cause a consumer to think about a particular brand, perhaps within a specific category, and that the approach of actually using category entry points as a way to apply that sort of classic marketing theory. So tell me a bit about that approach.
Yeah, so I think again this comes back to the fundamentals point, which is, I think sometimes we overlook the fact that marketing's actually pretty straightforward. It's pretty much make brands easy to think of and make brands easy to buy, and that's a key kind of premise that the Emberg Bass Institute kind of espouse. And I think therefore within that, they talk about brand growth through the lens of kind of the two aspects of mental availability and physical availability, which links to those 2 points. And within mental availability, the best way to think about that is through one, category entry points. Those cues or situations where someone moves from being out of a category to into a category. So being easy to be thought of in that specific moment. And then also how distinctive is your brand in terms of turning up at that moment? So how distinctive are the assets and the cues that turn up at that moment? So that's logos and colours and mascots and all those sorts of those things that are associated with that memory. So I think the category entry points piece I find really fascinating, because I think it's one of those things that's been really overlooked, I believe, and I think that's primarily because it tends to sit as chapter 5 in How Brands Grow Too, as kind of a piece of theory which people kind of can read, but it's quite hard to necessarily turn that into kind of practice and application. Sometimes at a marketing level, but especially at a kind of a media level, and I think it's become really, really important because it's specifically linked to this point around consideration, and in the column that you just mentioned, I kind of wrote about the fact that the marketing funnel is about 100 years old now, first kind of espoused in a salesmanship book a long time ago, and the marketing industry is kind of we talk about awareness at the top at traditional level, and you can kind of buy awareness and kind of grow awareness through just weight of spend. And conversion kind of sits at the bottom, and you kind of the growth of the performance world and sector means that has become easier to kind of navigate. But this consideration layer through the middle, which I think is still problematic for a lot of marketers, and that's common across most marketing and advertising briefs. How do we kind of build consideration? And that's where I think category entry points become really interesting, because they effectively turn that kind of consideration metric into loads of dynamic, contextual motive cues, and allows you to just really better understand kind of consideration in those moments, which therefore give you a better understanding of how you can then orchestrate your marketing and your media and advertising to really make your brand easier to think of.
Yeah, I think in the Colin, you call it sort of middle out planning.
Yeah.
Just really thinking about how you can use. So tell me a bit more about what that actually means in practice. How do you think about using category entry points in terms of your media selection and your understanding of consumers?
Yeah, so I think again it comes back to the point. In all of the theory, it seems quite tricky to understand category entry points on one level. But I think once you kind of get into it and kind of you've actually done some category entry points research to understand the specific brand in question and the specific category in question and how that relates to the linkages of the brand in question and the category entry points, what you can then start to do is really think about the prioritization of said category entry points. And that's one of the things we've done in the agency is kind of we've created a specific tool which kind of helps with that prioritization aspect. Because I think that's one of the things. It's all well and good doing the category entry points research and kind of understanding your mental market share and your mental availability and penetration size. But it's really how you prioritize, therefore, your category entry points at that point. And I think to that point about middle out planning, it starts to allow you to kind of look at, what are those 3 to 5 category entry points that you want to orient your marketing around. And then it starts to really inform kind of all aspects of kind of the creative marketing cycle in terms of how you kind of show up. So it can inform to one degree. We're working with some clients where it starts to inform the business aspect. So what kind of what does the kind of the trade aspects of those category entry points kind of unlock in terms of where you should be prioritizing. It allows you kind of to think about and collaborate with our kind of creative partners in terms of these are the sort of advertising vehicles we want to create at a kind of a mass macro level. It can allow us to think more cleanly around what are the contexts that we want to show up in. So there may be specific moments that are kind of out there in the world where we want to be, we want to make sure that our media turns up at that specific category entry point, and really kind of bring back, the contextual element of planning. And then equally, it can also help us at kind of the conversion moment where we start to think about, how can that inform, keyword design, dynamic creative optimizations, all of those kind of stuff that happens at that part in the consumer journey. So it allows you to start to build out a kind of everything from kind of business strategy to advertising strategy to media through the middle of the funnel through to kind of a performance aspect, and start to inform from that middle moment where category entry points can really drive the success across the overall marketing plan.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's just a really different way of thinking about the funnel, I suppose. And it reminds me a bit of that. There's the sort of moments that matter kind of way of thinking about things. I mean, I guess you're thinking here about any of the kind of consumer needs or occasions, places, all the different category entry points that there might be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we generally kind of break them down in terms of there's kind of emotive ones. So we work with the National Lottery, and there are things like I'm feeling lucky is kind of a kind of really emotive kind of category entry point. But then you've just got real rational ones. I've got some spare change in my pocket when I'm in the post office or in the supermarket. So you can kind of we kind of work out what are the priorities and which are the biggest ones, which are the most frequent ones. So you can really design a strategy for where there's headroom in the short term, but also the long term as well.
So let's build on that, because and we'll take this into this idea of sort of fragmented fame, I think you call it as well, in another one of your columns. So obviously we're operating in the midst of a very fragmented media environment, more channels than ever, more opportunities than ever to engage consumers in lots of different ways. And the point you make in that column is about how difficult it is in that environment to really create fame, and the idea, of course, that fame correlates clearly with effectiveness. So tell me a bit more about why it's difficult in the fragmented media environment, and also what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's that piece is a collaboration with Lizette Jones, who's a strategist on my team, who wrote as part of the OP Excellence diploma a couple of years ago around this concept of fragmented fame. And She'd originally written about it in terms of the context of scale-up brands, and we wanted to bring it up to date because I think the application is actually for all brands rather than just scale-up brands. And as you say, it's fame was kind of really kind of brought to the forefront of marketers thinking way back in 2012, 2013 when the long and the short of it came out. When Les Binet and Peter Field talked about that fame sort of makes marketing more effective. To your point, it drives bigger business results, reduces price sensitivity. So it's really important as a KPI for marketers to orient around. But I think it was last year, John Hegarty kind of wrote this point that universal fame is really hard to really create now because media fragmentation has killed those kind of collective cultural moments. And in the column we talk about the fact that Gavin and Stacey at Christmas, I think it did 19 million viewers once it had kind of been consolidated past Christmas Day, and everyone kind of held it up as kind of like this big cultural moment. And we were just talking about the fact 20 years ago Coronation Street did that every night.
Right. Yes.
And it was just like this it's just symptomatic of like how the kind of the media landscape has shifted dramatically, and there's kind of collective moments from a universal level don't really happen anymore. So it actually means that we need to really rethink. All brands need to rethink what fame looks like as linear TV to some degree starts to decline, and media consumption now happens across multiple video platforms at multiple different times. I sit in my living room and everyone's on a different screen watching different things at different times, and it's that collective moment is not where it used to be. I mean, there's still like I said, there's a Gavin Stacey example, and there are things like live football events and Olympics and Paralympics does kind of unite the nation at various points, but they're just fewer and fewer in between these days. And we kind of make this analogy of even the point, Andy Warhol famously said everyone's going to be famous for 15 minutes, and it's like now I think everyone wants to be famous for 15 seconds in the feed. It's like that's the kind of ambition of most these days, and that's the context that brands now need to operate in.
So you mentioned about rather than this kind of this shift, I suppose, from that sort of cultural universal collective kind of moment where we have a mass audience doing one thing at the same time, to this idea of kind of fragmented frame and building from the bottom up. So tell me a bit more about how you would do that from a media planning perspective or communications planning perspective to build from the bottom up.
Yeah, so I think this is we make this point that we talk about Addison Rae, who your parents probably might not know about, but she's still got nearly 100 million followers on social media, and there are multiple examples of that. A few years ago, Mr. Beast was kind of another good example. He's kind of hit the mainstream now to some degree with his game show on Amazon, but I think it now means that when we start to think about kind of online communities and wider communities as well, I think that's where we start kind of bottom up in terms of we really need to as much as it's important to reach all category buyers all the time. When we think about things like this, I think it's really important to build community upwards, and that can be passion communities, or it can be kind of local communities, which I think is another kind of oft overlooked kind of aspect of marketing and brand building, as well as kind of those kind of interest groups, online communities. And it's really kind of starting to not necessarily just think about the kind of the bigger influencers, but there's plenty of kind of micro influencers where you can start to build bottom up essentially, in terms of how you structure that kind of overall approach.
Yeah, and I mean that's quite challenging, isn't it?
It is.
Really, I mean, because you're thinking here about how you can. I think you talk about connecting overlapping communities through shared interests, but in order to do that, of course, you need to really understand those different communities, map them out, understand where the overlaps are. That's quite a difficult thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But I think we've always kind of loved the segmentation, and I think it's just like the new world of segmentation. It's just like actually, we really need to, rather than rethinking things in terms of kind of the traditional sense of segmentation. It's actually, we need to get into strategists, especially, and planners need to get into, the culture of a category. I think Rob Campbell talked about this. It's like understanding the real culture of the category is where really good strategic thinking happens. And I think that's just what that means today for a media planner, is getting into the behavior and consumption and understanding of consumers at that kind of real grassroots, overlapping interest, cultural and community level. It's one part. It's not all of it, but it's certainly something that planners need to really understand to build brands these days.
Yeah, and the ideas and the content itself. I mean, the emotional resonance, the shareability of it, of course. But
yeah,
I think you kind of talk a bit about what was it, three layers, I think it was. So it's like land, expand, and remix, which was quite an interesting approach. So tell me a bit about how you would use that kind of three-tiered approach to kind of grow from the bottom up.
Yeah, so I think this is again working with the right people at the right community level who understands those people, and making sure that you really kind of land in those groups with whether that's pure creators or influencer collaboration at kind of that micro level, but making sure that you land an idea in those groups that has empathy and is kind of right for those groups first and foremost. But then from there on in, it's then, how do you then start to look at the overlaps and where you can expand in terms of reach and kind of the bigger communities to then start to grow your circles of influence. And then that kind of final kind of remix approach is something I'm kind of, very passionate about in terms of, you need to leave space in brand communications these days when you're in the digital realm for people to kind of, play with the brand kind of codes if you feel confident enough to let loose in that respect.
Yeah.
But that's almost, you've got to think like a meme, not an ad in some respects, when you start building kind of this kind of work from the ground up in these kind of online creator and influencer spaces.
And the overlap as well is quite interesting. So by this I'm reading that you're kind of talking here really about people who are interested in this one thing also will be interested in something else, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
It could be like a yoga community which will be interested in meditation or something, but there's lots of common ground between those two things. But there will also be people who are only interested in each one of those things as well. So why does that actually enable that kind of scalability?
Yeah, because I think look, no one's interested in just one thing. It's like, I'm interested in rock climbing, 90s jungle. I've got 2 kids. It's I'm a lead supporter. It's like I'm in multiple different communities. So you get, again, if you just operate within a one-dimensional view of kind of people, you end up that's certainly not the right way to go. So it's just a case of, as you say, how do you really kind of understand the overlaps within those kind of expansion groups, but also you can start to look at where are things that are not necessarily you would think of. So there may be adjacent groups which are not necessarily what you would initially think of, but rock climbing and me supporting Leeds United are not necessarily kind of natural bedfellows, but you can kind of start to build out a picture with that kind of audience strategy once you kind of understand the groups and the reach of them.
Yeah, and I mean the whole remix idea is quite interesting as well, isn't it? Because that's a fine line to tread, isn't it? Really, between allowing freedom and flexibility for people to play around and to have that sort of bring play into it, to kind of remix things and to create humorous things or whatever. But also you want to protect your brand. You want to make sure that actually it's always positioned or seen in the right way. So how do you do that? How do you actually tread that fine line between those two different elements?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier for kind of nascent digital born brands, so it's a lot harder for if you're a bigger multinational. But I think it's certainly working with the right partners. You don't need to let everyone go wholesale and start saying that people can play with the logo, or completely remix the video asset.
Yeah.
You know, but there are certainly ways into it. We've done some work recently with Euro Millions, where we realised that you know, there's a very famous kind of meme around, you know, if I won the lottery, there'd be signs, which, you know, it's the class, and it's everyone always kind of posts like wild stuff, like I'd hang a money in my downstairs toilet, or, you know, I'd buy a Japanese theme park and put it in my back garden, all this sort of stuff.
Right.
But we just transposed that kind of mimetic structure onto kind of the way that we were thinking about winning, and the way people were kind of talking and sharing around Euro Millions, and just let people play with that within the confines of that meme, which doesn't necessarily disrupt the brand necessarily, but it allows people to play with that kind of idea, which was already live in culture anyway, within a couple of media partners, to really kind of expand and remix kind of what was already there, and that's been really successful for us. And I think it's a good template for kind of how you think about this sort of stuff. Is you don't need to let everyone loose on the brand playbook, but you can give people access to certain things, or the framework for things within a media partner or a cultural partner, and let people play around with stuff where the guardrails are in place.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of that. I mean, that brings us quite nicely onto the subject of memes. And you've actually written something here which is quite interesting about why strategists should really understand them, and also how they can be a source of insights as well. So as we've got lots of planners and strategists that listen to the podcast, obviously. So tell me a bit more about why you think it's important that strategists should pay attention to memes.
Well, I think it's pretty. I mean, my kids are generally a good source of insight in terms of what's happening next, and you know, the fact that I think it was maybe a year or two ago, and we were buying classic Christmas board games or whatever, and there was a bloody like what's my meme game, and I was like, blimey, it's hit, and they were like, oh yeah, I know this meme, I know that meme, and I just kind of realised that it's. My kids are just, that's how they communicate. It's just like such a massive way of communicating.
Yeah.
So I'm really old now, like the young people. No one wants to be the Steve Buscemi meme where he's like, how do you do, fellow kids? Which is what I feel like I'm turning into right now. But I think as much as that, it was that moment when my kids were like, I realized like my kids were like fully kind of understanding of kind of memes in culture. When you look at the kind of the wider kind of usage and research, it's like most people have used or shared a meme in the past week. I think it's around 75% of people who have shared one in some form. They're just a part of wider culture now. And so I think it's important. It's important for brands. Again, it comes back to that point that Rob made about you need to really understand the culture of a category. And if you're working with a brand in a certain category, you need to really understand the codes of that category. And memes are one aspect of how consumers or people are kind of responding and using and playing with memes in that category. So I think it's another way of getting to some sharp, good insight in when you're working with a brand these days. And I think if you're not thinking about them, then you're kind of missing a subsection of how the people that you want to talk to are actually using digital culture.
Yeah, I suppose it's it gives you a real insight, doesn't it? I suppose into how people think about something.
Absolutely.
Because they're kind of using it and remixing it, and actually it's all about people's perception, and it's only funny because other people can relate to it. So it's like a shared understanding, right? Is that really what you're saying here about how it can be valuable as a source of insight?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a good point there about humor as well. Is there's been much written over the past kind of few years about the lack of humor in advertising. But guess what? There's a lot of humor in memes. It's like that is generally what people are trying to kind of elicit as a response. So I think trying to kind of understand that as as a bedfellow of kind of, you know, how we create better advertising is interesting as well. And like I said, the Euro Millions is an example of how, you know, we specifically went into, you know, how people are really, you know, talking about that category, and really took something which was already the way that they were talking and responding and thinking about an aspect of kind of lottery based culture, and used that for Euro Millions as part of the overall approach. So I think it's hugely insightful as a way of thinking about the real way people are thinking about category.
And I suppose to build on what you're saying there, it's also quite an interesting way of thinking about how, well, cultural shifts, you know, so what's actually changing and how people's perception of certain topics or issues or whatever it is actually changing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the fact that it can help you with both, things like sentiment of memes is you know, an analysis of how that's shifting is interesting. You know, how you can also use them in terms of kind of the feedback loop. I think sometimes it's more insightful than traditional methods. And coming back to that point about how you build fame bottom up as well, it really helps understand kind of those niche audiences or kind of, you know, the smaller audiences as well.
I mean, one of the challenges I think probably that strikes me around this is that, you know, there's some memes obviously which are long term and they exist for a long period of time, but there's others which just really come and go very quickly. And you're talking about a matter of days, really. So if you're a planner or a strategist, how do you really either capitalize on that or understand that? You know, it's just changing so fast.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to the again, I'm going to talk about Euro Millions for a moment. It's like that was useful for us in terms of what we realized was because it was one of those kind of evergreen kind of memes which had kind of, you know, I think it had blown up on Instagram about a year earlier. So it still had kind of longevity because people had kind of adopted it as kind of just the way that they talked about the category. So I think it's looking for those to some degree in terms of opportunities. Versus, I think if you end up chasing kind of daily cultural memes, it can be quite, you know, it's really difficult for a brand or a business to respond that quickly, unless you've got a real publisher social first, you know, operational model in place already, and it's just filled with risk as well, because, you know, you could be jumping on something which is going to blow out pretty quickly.
But I mean, I think your Euro Millions example is a really good one because that strikes me as a very kind of natural fit and an obvious fit. But I guess the risk here is that brands are trying to sort of jump onto something because that's where the audience are going. And the risk is that they're sort of seen as inauthentic, perhaps.
Yeah, and it comes back to that. I mean, I kind of mentioned it. That Steve Buscemi meme is kind of the one thing that you don't want to be. It's kind of turning up in the, you know, and getting it's quite easy to get it wrong. So I think it's you know, it's one of those things where you can't just go, you know, what's our meme strategy? You can't just go, right, where's the meme line on the plan? It's like it's just too it's not that easy to kind of orchestrate. It's a bit like, if you remember 10, 15 years ago or 20 years, you know, when people would get, when you know, brands or marketing teams would be like, can you give us a viral, we want a video which goes viral or an idea that goes viral. It's a bit like, you know, it's kind of intangible in that aspect, because it's like you can't really create virality, you know, you can't predict it. So you really need to look for those moments or memes which are, especially for brands, I think you need to look for kind of evergreen stuff, which is kind of related to the category, where you can start to play in. I think if you're looking for stuff which is kind of like exploding in 24 hours and disappearing again, it's, yes, you can be reactive if you've got everything in the right place and you've got a strategy in place which links directly to that meme, but it's like the stars don't align very often for all of that to happen and for everything to kind of activate that quickly. So I think you've got to find a way of a slightly more nuanced, longer term approach to this stuff. Even though it's moving quickly, brands need to be a little bit slower.
Yeah, and I suppose just to kind of capture or summarize what we've been saying there, I mean, it's a fascinating idea, and I think it strikes me there's a bit of an audience out, category in type of approach here. So audience out would be, it enables you to understand an audience better because you're seeing how they communicate and talk about a topic. And the perception, but also category in, because you can take, you know, topics which are relevant to the category and actually look at the memes that are relevant to that. Is that a fair way of kind of capturing?
Yeah, it's a good way of kind of yeah, talking about that. Yeah,
and both of them being relevant, of course. Yeah, not just
yeah. And I think you've got to get both. You know, for especially for advertising or a brand, you've got to get both right. Otherwise, if you've just got the audience piece, it can kind of feel slightly, you know, it's all well and good picking up something which your audience may well be interested in, but if it hasn't got that category aspect to it, then it just becomes, you know, just stuff in their feed.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think this probably leads us really quite nicely into talking a bit about disrupting norms from a media perspective, because I think, you know, the potential of memes is, you know, one way of doing that possibly, but you've also written before now about how brands can gain a competitive advantage really by disrupting media behaviors and norms. Why do you think disruption can be a sort of powerful kind of lever, if you like, to actually gaining better traction or having much more effectiveness?
I think this also goes back to, you know, the first point about forgetting the fundamentals. When we talk about innovation, I remember I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, which was there's I think there's an article by Stephen King, Planet JWT, where he talks about it's 1985, where he talks about how has marketing failed, and he talks about kind of there are four aspects of marketing: thrust marketing, which is about price cutting; marketing department marketing, which is just doesn't necessarily have a link to product teams; it's just marketing in a silo; accountant marketing, which feels very timely today with, you know, I think it's over half of FTSE 100 CEOs of finance backgrounds and formula background in terms of doing what the category does. And he kind of says real marketing is kind of one of there are four things that he says is real marketing. But, you know, even in 1985, he was saying that innovation is kind of critical. And I think that's where kind of the disruption piece fits in. Is like it's really a kind of a truism of kind of real marketing. It's like you've got to be innovative and disruptive because the category is constantly changing, behaviors are constantly changing. If you just do what you did yesterday all the time, you will quickly get eaten up or destroyed, or someone will shop somewhere else. I mean, the Kantar kind of stat is, you know, disruption increases brand value by about 123%, which I think is what their analysis showed. And if you combine creativity and disruption with great advertising, then it increases to 265%. So it's like, you know, it's kind of held as a, I think, coming back to that, forgetting the fundamentals, it's regarded as a fundamental of kind of what marketing should do, but it's also a kind of a truism of you know, it's important to the bottom line as well. And not everyone is the category leader, so, you know, there's only space for number one in every category. So everyone else needs to find a way of doing something you know, disruptive to some degree to try and usurp or catch up with the number one.
So are we really talking here about the ability to disrupt category norms, or is it more about sort of media norms and the expected places that you would look to see a brand?
Well, I mean, I work in a media agency, so I take a media lens to this, obviously. So I think you know, the three tenets of kind of disruption that I talk about are really, you know, you've got to primarily understand the conventions of the category, and that's you know, I say this repeatedly to you know, people in the agency who are on day one all the way through to people who work with me now. It's like you know, the understanding the context of the category and everything about the competition is really important, because otherwise, you know, you've got no real foundation to disrupt them. So that first tenet is really like, you know, how can you really understand the conventions and what's actually happening? Otherwise, if you're talking about disruption, and plenty of kind of clients and people want disruption to some degree, but it just ends up being, you know, if you don't know conventions of the category are, you're just disrupting. There's no structure for it. There's no strategy for it. It's just, it's really important to create a definition for what disruption means. And one of the starting points is obviously the conventions of the category. And then the second kind of building block of that is then really understanding, yourself, the brand, and the way you operate. And then also it's kind of not only the past, going back to that fundamentals point, what happened in the past, but also what the future direction of the category is and consumption as well. So, even when we talk about, long-term media thinking or existing media thinking and what that means in the long term, you've got to think about the forces of change that are happening to consumers. And that could be memes, or it could be the relationship of where category entry points fit into that kind of world of media, and how you structure that. But you've got to think about, how gaming is going to become ever more and more important. Linear TV is in decline. What are those things that are going to be important in 2 to 3 years time as well? So you're building towards that as well. And only once you've got those two things, really, once you've got those kind of conventions of the category and the forces of change and your understanding of yourself, can you really create a definition of what disruption should look like for a business. And that's obviously, I bring a media lens to that, but I think that's equally applicable to other aspects as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think you talk about, how disruption could be you're reaching underserved audiences perhaps, or it could be maybe looking at new distribution channels, or indeed like unconventional media channels perhaps for the category. Yeah, so lots of different ways into this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, it comes back to some of the themes of the memes piece as well. Is that may unlock smaller communities that you may want to think about reaching or talking to. But equally, it may mean there are other larger groups that you want to talk to. It gives you an angle in terms of the media channels. There may be specific spaces which the competition are not utilising, and then equally, like you say, it could be distribution channels. How do we make everything more shoppable? How do we make things easier to buy? And it comes back to that original point. How do we make things easier to think of and easier to buy? And it's like if you follow that thread, it's again what are the building blocks of disruption that can make us easier to think of and create advantages in those spaces. And through physical availability, the growth of retail media and shoppability and commerce makes it there should be no dead ends in terms of how we think about the media plan. It should be much easier to buy by token as well.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. We're running short on time, unfortunately, Simon, but that's been absolutely fascinating. I've just got one question here, because just to bring everything together that we talked about today, I guess one of the big themes for me has been about category focus. So we talked earlier on about category entry points and how that is a really important way of understanding, planning, but also category culture. We talked about understanding the culture of a category. And then latterly, we talked a lot about, understanding category conventions and norms as a way to kind of get more effectiveness and to disrupt potentially. So if you were to have one piece of advice for planners, strategists, or indeed any marketer looking to really understand or get under the skin of a category, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, I think I'd always say category entry points, or kind of to that point about middle out planning, because I think that allows you to understand a lot of different aspects of what you're talking about. But I think linked to that is and you can only really define a category entry points, which is the point which probably sits above all of this, which is you've really got to define the category that you're in and the category that you want to be in the future as well. Again, coming back to the forgetting the fundamentals piece, Theodore Levitt wrote a piece about really understanding the business that you're in is really important, because if you don't, you'll quickly go out of business. And I think it's equally applicable to what category you're in and how you really define and think about that. And that then unlocks all of those things that you were just talking about in terms of what are the digital conventions, what are the media conventions, what are the category entry points, all those building blocks then naturally unlock or kind of sit beneath that kind of new category definition. So I think being really clear on the category definition, and then within that you can then start to unpick and understand the other elements of that through those things that we talked about.
Brilliant. Simon, that's been super insightful, just really fascinating to talk about all of those different aspects of understanding categories, but also the importance of marketing fundamentals, of course, in a fragmented media world. So my thanks for the time and for your inputs. It's been absolutely fascinating. And if you are watching or listening to the podcast, don't forget to share if you enjoyed this episode. But my thanks again to Simon Carr for being such a brilliant guest. Thank you very much, Simon.